could we be 3 days away from two-tier sentencing guidelines falling down on this country?
Well, joining us now is Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, Robert Jenrick. Robert Jenrick, thank you very much indeed for joining us. You've been counting down. You're saying that time is running out before these guidelines are in place. I mean, we've heard today that Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, has been, well, pretty much rebuffed entirely by the Sentencing Council. It doesn't look like they're going to revise or change these rules at all. But I suppose time has run out on anything going through Parliament.
That's right. Look, the Justice Secretary promised that there would not be two-tier justice on her watch. She lied. In just 3 days' time, we will live in a country where your path through the justice system will be partly dictated by the colour of your skin or the faith that you abide by. And we will have two-tier justice under two-tier Keir. I brought forward a bill and gave the Justice Secretary a way out. She refused to take it. I said, use your powers of appointment to sack the members of the Sentencing Council who have imposed this upon us all. She didn't do it. She sat on her hands. Keir Starmer has done nothing to resolve this issue. It's shameful, and we are going to find ourselves on the 1st of April, April Fool's Day, living in a country with two-tier justice under two-tier Keir.
This is a stark moment, of course, but what Shabana Mahmood has been saying is she has been trying to change this. She wrote this letter to the Sentencing Council underpinned with the threat of legislation if they did not act. Clearly, they haven't acted. Is it not unfair to the Justice Secretary to say she hasn't tried to stop this?
No, the Justice Secretary has been totally asleep at the wheel. She didn't even know about these sentencing guidelines until I raised them with her in the House of Commons. She then held a meeting and a week later wrote a letter to the Sentencing Council. They've come back now and totally rebuffed her. She's been humiliated. She hasn't brought forward emergency legislation. She rebuffed my bill that would have fixed this. The best time to have done emergency legislation would have been when these two-tier guidelines were first approved. The second best time is to do it now. So unless she brings forward emergency legislation on Monday, and of course we would back her if she did, then she will have totally failed. And by her own admission, she will be presiding over two-tier justice our country.
Robert, this issue was raised by GB News to the Prime Minister today, and he seemed to... Christopher Hope, our political editor, asked whether he'd even think about axing the Quango altogether, axing the Sentencing Council, and he didn't say no. So could Shabana Mahmood turn to the Prime Minister, perhaps, to get this sorted, and that could be the way out?
Look, this is all too little, too late. They have had weeks to resolve this. I have been raising it time and again in Parliament, on the media, and they've obviously done absolutely nothing. They've sat on their hands. Well, look, now it's crunch time. They've got just a matter of days to resolve this. And I can't escape the conclusion that they actually support this. Because if they cared as passionately as I do about this, they would have done something already. They would have backed my bill. They would have sacked the members of the Sentencing Council. They would have reformed it, frankly, because it's clearly totally out of control. They haven't done any of those things.
Would you scrap it, Robert Jenrick, if you were in office at the moment?
Well, I said I would use the powers of appointment to sack the members of the Sentencing Council, and I do think it needs to be reformed, because I don't think it's right that decisions of great importance that cut to the very heart of the rule of law, equality before the law, should be being made by this Quango that seems totally unaccountable to ministers and to Parliament. But now we just have 3 days to stop two-tier justice in our country, and Shabana Mahmood has done nothing to resolve this problem.
The Sentencing Council has been working on this for more than 8 months. They've been working on this for more than the time that the Labour government has been in office. And people in the Justice Department do point to perhaps the Conservative Party being asleep at the wheel as well as these formulations were beginning under the Sentencing Council. That's one issue. That these new guidelines were beginning to be drawn up when your party was in power. But there's a second issue here too, which is that they're not the only guidelines that courts and indeed judges must face. Being implemented on the 1st of April last year, 2024, were guidelines for courts that they should take into account the low educational attainment, insecure housing, mental health difficulties, poverty, whether or not they're a care leaver, the experience of loss, neglect or abuse, or indeed negative influence from peers. These are all things that courts were told to take into account of accused rapists. Was that right last year?
But I don't think that that's right. I want to see equality before the law. That is the absolute foundational principle of the rule of law. And no one should be having a different route through the justice system because of some of these factors. Of course, there are things we should take into account. For example, pregnant women, whether or not they go to prison. And that's an important consideration, to think about to protect the mother and the unborn child. But it should not be about the colour of your skin or the faith that you abide by. That's the principle that we're defending here.
But this was happening
why we've got
under
to
the
stop these
Conservatives
guidelines going into place.
as well.
Well, just on your point about
peers.
the guidelines themselves, the Sentencing Council, in their recent letter to the Justice Secretary, made very clear that the guidelines that are going to come into place on the 1st of April are materially different to any ones that were considered by the last Conservative government. The present Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, had a representative at the very meeting at which these were approved. It's all minuted. No objection was raised. So I'm afraid this is on her. She's had weeks to resolve it. She's done nothing. And now on April Fool's Day, 1st of April, we're going to be living in a country marked by two-tier justice under two-tier Keir, and it needs to be fixed.
Same day, all our bills go up as well. Robert Jenrick, thank you very much indeed. Shadow Secretary of State for Justice there, zooming in from Nottinghamshire.
Yeah. It is actually extraordinary.
That is a good point, that they have been taking these types of things into, can you compare the sort of identity things with things like poverty and that sort of thing?
Ultimately, either justice is blind or it isn't. Yeah. But I do take Robert Jenrick's point that, there have been things that Parliament has legislated for in incredible speed.
Yes.
The Benn Act in 2019 was passed in 3 days. Just 3 days. That's when Parliament was trying to stop a no-deal Brexit. So they passed that act of Parliament.
They could do it for that.
It's true, legislation can take years, certainly the bulk of a year. But when Parliament puts its mind to something, it can really rush, especially a simple bill. For example, a one-line bill wiping out these guidelines, it could pass it in very short time.
Clearly not a priority.
Yeah. Well,
worth writing a letter, worth meeting once or twice, but not worth legislating.
Well, the Prime Minister has spoken on this. Of course, he was asked by Christopher Hope about this decision from the Sentencing Council. This is what he had to say.
Sir Keir Starmer, the Sentencing Council is saying that it won't amend guidance which could see more white men jailed from next week. What are you going to do? Are you going to axe this quango?
Well, look, I'm disappointed in this response, and the Lord Chancellor is obviously continuing to engage on this, and we're considering our response. All options are on the table, but I am disappointed at this outcome, and now we'll have to consider what we do as a result.
What can you do? You're in a huge amount. You're in the majority. Axe the quango?
Well, look, we're looking at options at the moment, but all options are on the table because we're now going to have to respond to this. It's disappointing news.
And in response to the Sentencing Council's decision not to amend their new guidelines, the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood MP, said, "I have been clear in my view that these guidelines represent differential treatment under which someone's outcomes may be influenced by their race, culture or religion. This is unacceptable, and I formally set out my objections to this in a letter to the Sentencing Council last week. I am extremely disappointed by the Council's response. All options are on the table, and I will legislate if necessary." Well, 3 days. She'll have to legislate very quickly or legislate in retrospect, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't see how this doesn't happen. They're not going to recall Parliament for the weekend. Parliament starts at 2:30 in the afternoon on Monday. They'll have literally hours to write a bill, get it from the Commons to the Lords and back again, all the committee, all the report stages, and then off to the King to sign into law. It's not going to happen.
So sick of, politicians saying they really care deeply about certain issues, but they're not actually doing the action to back it up.